Now, the destructive Democrat agenda is failing on all fronts, and nowhere is it more apparent than in our Democrat-run far-left cities. For example, out in California, homicides jumped 31% last year. In San Francisco, a new survey finds that the city is on track to lose nearly half its residents in the years to come. And in Minneapolis, get this, a judge has ordered the city to hire more police officers after a ruling in favor of a group that sued the city council over surging crime. And perhaps the most tragic of all is in Chicago, where weekend after weekend, dozens upon dozens are shot. Over 1,500 so far this year. But failed Mayor Lori Lightfoot, she's still refusing to take any responsibility for her far-left failings and is blaming it all on, get this, racism and sexism.
Mayor, in recent months, there have been questions raised about your temperament and your reaction to criticism. Tribune editorial used the term irascible. How much of this do you think might have to do with the fact that you're a woman, and specifically a black woman?
About 99% of it. Women and people of color are always held to a different standard. I understand that. I've known that my whole life.
Shameful. That's absolutely shameful. So ask yourself, how is it the same people who claim to care about lives in our urban areas are the same ones fueling policies that make the quality of life worse and worse? Defunding police, never-ending attacks on law enforcement, far-left socialism, government dependency, all while taking no responsibility for the human suffering and the human toll, the loss of life, and the loss of human dignity taking place on their watch month after month, week after week, and day after day. Quite frankly, it is disgraceful. The Democratic Party, the far-left Washington machine, and their allies in the media, they are leaving these communities behind. How often do you hear the names of the victims of shootings in those cities? Why aren't there protests for those lives? And why aren't there massive fundraising campaigns for those families? Because it's Democrats. They really don't care at all. They love having the issue. They love stoking the division. They love raising the money, but they never actually want to find a solution. And the worst part, it's all by design, because they are frauds. They're grifters, and they couldn't be less interested in delivering real results for poor and working Americans all across the country. Now, joining me for a reaction, civil rights attorney Leo Terrell and outnumbered co-host Emily Campagno. This has to be, Emily, one of the more shocking things. You know, I want women to be in office. I want all kinds of people to have, experience in governing cities. And this is what tribal politics does. Then destroying a city, and then she blames racism and sexism. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you, and it's also disingenuous. She campaigned over 2 years ago on diminishing the, quote, unyielding violence in the communities of Chicago. She knew exactly what she was getting into, only to see it spike by 50% her second year, the homicides. And then, for example, after Memorial Day weekend last month, when there were 49 shootings and homicides, she came out and said this is a bloodbath and it's unacceptable. Only now, in the face of criticism, rightly so, and the public outcry, she calls it all of a sudden racist and sexist, when she herself came out from the beginning to say she would do something about it. We all know from her internal emails that she's some type of maniac running the office too, so it's also disingenuous for her to say that criticism of how she runs this toxic office is anything less than everything flowing from her, but she is letting down the community, to your point, Tammy, and to the loss of lives of, for example, this past weekend, a 1-month-old.
It's heartbreaking, and it is horrific. Leo, we've got a dynamic here where we claim and we know that people of color, women, men, everybody can be as great as a counterpart or as bad. We know this for a fact. And yet here she is, right? She ran as a reformer, shockingly, as Emily has really laid out. And the lives that are being lost, truly, are people of color, are brown and black communities being destroyed. And she seems to just be fine with that. How is this possible?
Well, just look at this table. Look at this panel right here. Diversity, women, black. She tries to speak, Tammy, for all of us, which I reject. She said women and people of color are treated at a different standard. That's a lie. She's trying to hide and conceal her incompetence by saying that blacks and women are at a disadvantage. That's not true. I don't see a disadvantage to you, Tammy, or Emily. It's a lie. It's a cover-up. And what's so sad about it is she plays the race card, and she's in charge of the system. And you're right. People of color are being killed, and yet the attention to it is being disregarded. An Oakland mayor, Tammy, an Oakland police chief, was begging the Oakland City Council, don't cut the funds. I need the money. They cut it anyway. Democrats don't care about people of color. They use them as pawns, and yet their lives are worthless. And that's what you see in Chicago and in all these Democratic cities. It is shameful, Tammy.
Yeah, the Oakland example is perfect. Incredibly eloquent plea from that man about what mattered in a community. And yet this is what tribalism does. This is what identity politics does, Emily. And it's being used now against the very people that have been trained into believing that that was going to be their salvation, to obscure the death and destruction, if that's even possible. This is, and look, let's admit it. It's clear, I think, in people's lives, there is a different life experience for black men. There's a different life experience for gay people, for women who are perceived to be women of color. There is a difference. But if we make excuses and then allow politicians to ruin our lives and then to blame something else when it's their incompetence, we're not going to make any headway, Emily, on any of these issues.
That's exactly right. And there in Oakland, which is the city I was born in, the police chief called it a crisis, the same word used by the lieutenant mayor and the police chief in Seattle, where I currently live. They said it was a public crisis there, the thinning, the eroding of the police ranks, the unilateral defunding of the budget. We saw as well the judge that's in charge of the consent decree between the Department of Justice and the police department there said it took them 2 steps back. He said, what were you thinking doing this unilaterally? You have set back meaningful criminal justice reform, he said. By doing this, we saw the same thing in Portland, a unilateral defunding of the police. The mayor begged to refund some of the funds, and the city council wouldn't even hear at the hearing the topic on the floor. They had to restore funds instead to park rangers, to community volunteers, and you can guess how that went. The people who are suffering the most are these communities of color. We know this in Chicago. 73% of those homicides are young black men as well. It's the youth suffering.
You know, great point. And Leo, you know, we're talking tonight about what can people do locally. We've seen them go to the school board meetings. But when we talk about, as Emily noted, about the city councils, people have got to start going to the city council to be heard, because I think a lot of these local entities have not necessarily heard from their citizens.
I think you're absolutely right, Tim. We got to start small with these small city council, school boards, and take over these Democratic cities, which have been in control for over 50 years. And you see the destruction and the poverty in these Democratic cities. We got to start small and work our way up. And what I agree with your previous panel, we got to take over in 2022 on a national level.
It has to be all of this. It's not a zero-sum game. It's everything. On this 4th of July weekend, reassert that we are the sovereign. We must begin to act within the structure of what the founders expected, which was involvement at the local level, and of course then the translation of that at the federal one. Emily and Leo, thank you very much. Now, coming...
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.